Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang, Episode 4. Greetings and salutations. Thank you for tuning in to Fireside Tailes with Wolfgang. I am Hunter Ackerman. Wolfgang and I would like to welcome you all for readings of some world-renowned classics. So, Wolfus, what would you like to hear?
Sredni Vashtar by Saki. Conradin was 10 years old, and the doctor had pronounced his professional opinion that the boy would not live another 5 years. The doctor was silky and effete and counted for little, but his opinion was endorsed by Mrs. de Ropp, who counted for nearly everything. Mrs. de Ropp was Conradin's cousin and guardian, and in his eyes, she represented those 3/5 of the world that are necessary and disagreeable and real. The other 2/5, in perpetual antagonism to the foregoing, were summed up in himself and his imagination. Right out of the gates, that had me as a 14 or 15-year-old. One of these days, Conradin supposed he would succumb to the mastering pressure of wearisome necessary things, such as illness and coddling restrictions and drawn-out dullness. Without his imagination, which was rampant under the spur of loneliness, he would have succumbed long ago. Mrs. de Ropp would never, in her honestest moments, have confessed to herself that she disliked Conradin, although she might have been dimly aware that thwarting him for his good was a duty which she did not find particularly irksome. Conradin hated her with a desperate sincerity which he was perfectly able to mask. Such few pleasures as he could contrive for himself gained an added relish from the likelihood that they would be displeasing to his guardian, and from the realm of his imagination she was locked out, an unclean thing which should find no entrance. In the dull, cheerless garden, overlooked by so many windows that were ready to open with a message not to do this or that, or a reminder that medicines were due, he found little attraction. The few fruit trees that it contained were set jealously apart from his plucking, as though they were rare specimens of their kind blooming in an arid waste. It would probably have been difficult to find a market gardener who would offer 10 shillings for their entire yearly produce. In a forgotten corner, however, almost hidden behind dismal shrubbery, was a disused tool shed of respectable proportions, and within its walls, Conradin found a haven, something that took on the varying aspects of a playroom and a cathedral. He had peopled it with a legion of familiar phantoms, evoked partly from fragments of history and partly from his own brain, but it also boasted 2 inmates of flesh and blood. In one corner lived a ragged, plumaged hoodoo hen, on which the boy lavished an affection that had scarcely another outlet. Further back in the gloom stood a large hutch, divided into 2 compartments, one of which was fronted with close iron bars. This was the abode of a large polecat ferret, which a friendly butcher boy had smuggled, cage and all, into its present quarters in exchange for long-secreted hoard of small silver. Conradin was dreadfully afraid of the lithe, sharp-fanged beast but it was his most treasured possession. Its very presence in the tool shed was a secret and fearful joy to be kept scrupulously from the knowledge of the woman he had privately dubbed his cousin. And one day, out of heaven knows what material, he spun the beast a wonderful name, and from that moment it grew into a god and a religion. The woman indulged in religion once a week at church nearby and took Conradin with her, but to him the church service was an alien rite in the house of Rumi. Every Thursday, in the dim and musty silence of the tool shed, he worshipped with mystic and elaborate ceremonial before the wooden hutch where dwelt Sredni Vashtar, the great ferret. Red flowers in their season and scarlet berries in the wintertime were offered at his shrine, for he was a god who laid some special stress on the fierce, impatient side of things, as opposed to the woman's religion, which, as far as Conradin could observe, went to great lengths in the contrary direction. And on great festivals, powdered nutmeg was strewed in front of his hutch, an important feature of the offering being that the nutmeg had to be stolen. These festivals were of irregular occurrence and were chiefly appointed to celebrate some passing event. On one occasion, when Mr. Ropp suffered from acute toothache for 3 days, Conradin kept up the festival during the entire 3 days and almost succeeded in persuading himself that Sredni Vashtar was personally responsible for the toothache. If the malady had lasted for another day, the supply of nutmeg would have given out. The Houdan hen was never drawn into the cult of Sredni Vashtar. Conradin had long ago settled that she was an Anabaptist. Now, he did not pretend to have the remotest knowledge as to what an Anabaptist was, but he privately hoped that it was dashing and not very respectable. Mr. Ropp was the ground plan on which he based and detested all respectability. After a while, Conradin's absorption in the tool shed began to attract the notice of his guardian. "It is not a good thing for him to be pottering down there in all weathers," she promptly decided, and at breakfast one morning she announced that the Houdan hen had been sold and taken away overnight. With her short-sighted eyes, she peered at Conradin, waiting for an outbreak of rage and sorrow which she was ready to rebuke with a flow of excellent precepts and reasoning, but Conradin said nothing. There was nothing to be said. Something, perhaps in his white, set face, gave her a momentary qualm, for at tea that afternoon there was toast on the table, a delicacy for which she usually banned on the ground that it was bad for him. Also, because the making of it gave trouble, a deadly offense in the middle-class feminine eye. "I thought you liked toast," she exclaimed with an injured air, observing that he did not touch it. "Sometimes," said Conradin. In the shed that evening, there was an innovation in the worship of the hutch god. Conradin had been wont to chant his praises. Tonight, he asked a boon. "Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar." The thing was not specified. As Sredni Vashtar was a god, he must be supposed to know, and choking back a sob, he looked at that other empty corner. Conradin went back to the world he so hated, And every evening in the welcome darkness of his bedroom, and every evening in the dusk of the tool shed, Conradin's bitter litany went up. Do one thing for me, Sredni Vashtar. Mrs. Durop noticed that the visits to the shed did not cease, and one day she made a further journey of inspection. What are you keeping in that locked hutch? She asked. I believe it's guinea pigs. I'll have them all cleared away. Conradin shut his lips tight, but the woman ransacked his bedroom till she found the carefully hidden key, and forthwith marched down to the shed to complete her discovery. It was a cold afternoon, and Conradin had been bidden to keep to the house. From the furthest window of the dining room, the door of the shed could just be seen beyond the corner of the shrubbery, and there Conradin stationed himself. He saw the woman enter, and then he imagined her opening the door of the sacred hutch and peering down with her short-sighted eyes into the thick straw bed where his god lay hidden. Perhaps she would prod at the straw in her clumsy impatience, and Conradin fervently breathed his prayer for the last time. But he knew as he prayed that he did not believe. He knew that the woman would come out presently with that pursed smile he loathed so well on her face, and that in an hour or two the gardener would carry away his wonderful god, a god no longer, but a simple brown ferret in a hutch. And he knew that the woman would triumph, always, as she triumphed now, and that he would grow ever more sickly under his pestering and domineering and superior wisdom, till one day nothing would matter much more with him, and the doctor would be proved right. And in the sting and misery of his defeat, he began to chant loudly and defiantly the hymn of his threatened idol. Sredni Vashtar went forth. His thoughts were red thoughts, and his teeth were white. His enemies called for peace, but he brought them death. Sredni Vashtar the Beautiful. And then, all of a sudden, he stopped his chanting and drew closer to the window pane. The door of the shed still stood ajar as it had been left, and the minutes were slipping by. They were long minutes, but they slipped by nevertheless. He watched the starlings running and flying in little parties across the lawn. He counted them over and over again, with one eye always on that swinging door. A sour-faced maid came in to lay the table for tea, and still Conradin stood and waited and watched. Hope had crept by inches into his heart, and now a look of triumph began to blaze in his eye that had only known the wistful patience of defeat. Under his breath, with a furtive exultation, he began once again the paean of victory and devastation, and presently his eyes were rewarded. Out through that doorway came a long, low, yellow and brown beast, with eyes ablink at the waning daylight and dark, wet stains around the fur of jaws and throat. Conradin dropped on his knees. The great polecat ferret made its way down to a small brook at the foot of the garden, drank for a moment, then crossed a little plank bridge and was lost to sight in the bushes. Such was the passing of Sredni Vashtar. "Tea is ready," said the sour-faced maid. "Where is the mistress?" "She went down to the shed some time ago," said Conradin, and while the maid went to summon her mistress to tea, Conradin fished a toasting fork out of the sideboard drawer and proceeded to toast himself a piece of bread. And during the toasting of it and the buttering of it, with much butter, and the slow enjoyment of eating it, Conradin listened to the noises and silences which fell in quick spasms beyond the dining room door. The loud, foolish screaming of the maid, the answering chorus of wandering ejaculations from the kitchen region, the scuttering footsteps and hurried embassies for outside help, and then, after a lull, the scared sobbings and the shuffling tread of those who bore a heavy burden into the house. "Whoever will break it to the poor child? I couldn't for the life of me," exclaimed a shrill voice. And while they debated the matter among themselves, Conradin made himself another piece of toast. The Open Window by Saki. "My aunt will be down presently, Mr. Nuttall," said a very self-possessed young lady of 15. "In the meantime, you must try and put up with me." Frampton Nuttall endeavored to say the correct something which should duly flatter the niece of the moment without unduly discounting the aunt that was to come. Privately, he doubted more than ever whether these formal visits on a succession of total strangers would do much toward helping the nerve cure which he was supposed to be undergoing. "I know how it will be," his sister had said when he was preparing to migrate to this rural retreat. "You will soon bury yourself down there and not speak to a living soul, and your nerves will be worse than ever from moping. I shall just give you letters of introduction to all the people I know there. Some of them, as far as I can remember, were quite nice." Frampton wondered whether Mrs. Stapleton, the lady to whom he was presenting one of the letters of introduction, came into the nice division. "Do you know many of the people round here?" asked the niece, when she judged that they had had sufficient silent communication. "Hardly a soul," said Frampton. "My sister was staying here at the rectory, some 4 years ago, and she gave me letters of introduction to some of the people here." He made the last statement in a tone of distinct regret. "Then you know practically nothing about my aunt," pursued the self-possessed young lady. "Only her name and address," admitted the caller. He was wondering whether Mrs. Stapleton was in the married or widowed state. An undefinable something about the room seemed to suggest masculine habitation. "Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago," said the child. "That would be since your sister's time." "Her tragedy?" asked Frampton. Somehow in this restful country spot, tragedies seemed out of place. "You may wonder why we keep that window wide open on an October afternoon," said the niece, indicating a large French window that opened onto a lawn. "It is quite warm for the time of year," said Frampton. "But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy?" Out through that window, 3 years ago today, her husband and her 2 young brothers went off for their day's shooting. They never came back. In crossing the moor to their favorite snipe shooting ground, they were all 3 engulfed in a treacherous piece of bog. It had been that dreadful wet summer, and places were safe and other years gave way suddenly without warning. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. Here the child's voice lost its self-possessed note and became falteringly human. "Poor auntie always thinks they will come back someday, and they and the little brown spaniel that was lost with them, and walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till it is quite dusk. Poor dear auntie, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white waterproof coat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, "Bertie, why do you bound?" and as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know, sometimes, on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get a creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. She broke off with a little shudder. It was a relief to Frampton when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. "I hope Vera has been amusing you," she said. "She has been very interesting," said Frampton. "I hope you don't mind the open window," said Miss Stapleton briskly. "My husband and brothers will be home directly from shooting, and they always come in this way. They've been out for a snipe in the marshes today, so they'll make a fine mess over my poor carpets. So like you menfolk, isn't it?" She rattled on cheerfully about the shooting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Frampton, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but only partial successful effort to turn the talk onto a less ghastly topic, but he was conscious that his hostess was giving him only a fragment of her attention, and her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window in the lawn beyond. It was certainly an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. "The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest. An absence in mental excitement and avoidance of anything in the nature of violent physical exercise," announced Frampton, who labored under the tolerably widespread delusion that total strangers and chance acquaintances are hungry for the least detail of one's ailments and infirmities, their cause and cure. "On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement," he continued. "No," said Miss Stapleton, in a voice which only replaced a yawn at the last moment. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention, but not to what Frampton was saying. "Here they are at last," she cried, "just in time for the tea, and they don't look as if they were muddy up to the eyes." Frampton shivered slightly and turned toward the niece with a look intended to convey sympathetic comprehension. The child was staring out through the open window with a dazed horror in her eyes. In a chill shock of nameless fear, Frampton swung round in his seat and looked the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them was additionally burdened with a white coat hung over his shoulders. A tired brown spaniel kept close at their heels. Noiselessly, they neared the house, and then a hoarse young voice chanted out of the dusk, "I said, Bertie, why do you bound?" Frampton grabbed wildly at his stick and hat. The hall door, the gravel drive, and the front gate were dimly noted the stages in his headlong retreat. A cyclist coming along the road had to run into the hedge to avoid imminent collision. "Here we are, my dear," said the bearer of the white mackintosh, coming in through the window. "Fairly muddy, but most of it's dry." "Who was that bolted as we came up?" "Most extraordinary man. Mr. Nuttall," said Miss Stapleton, "could only talk about his illnesses, and dashed off without word of goodbye or apology when you arrived. One would think he'd seen a ghost." "I expect it was the spaniel," said the niece calmly. "He told me he had a horror of dogs. He was once haunted into a cemetery somewhere on the banks of the Ganges by a pack of pariah dogs, and he had to spend the entire night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him, enough to make anyone lose their nerve. Romance, at short notice, was her specialty. The Pasture by Robert Frost. I'm going out to clean the pasture spring. I'll only stop to rake the leaves away and watch the water clear I may. I shan't be gone. You come too. I'm going out to fetch the little calf that's standing by the mother. It's so young it totters when she licks it with her tongue. I shan't be gone long. You come too. After 20 Years by O. Henry. The policeman on the beat moved up the avenue impressively. The impressiveness was habitual, not for show, for spectators were few. The time was barely 10 o'clock at night, but chilly gusts of wind with a taste of rain in them had well nigh peopled the streets. Trying doors as he went, twirling his club with many intricate and artful movements, turning now and then to cast his watchful eye down the Pacific thoroughfare, the officer, with his stalwart form and slight swagger, made a fine picture of a guardian of the peace. The vicinity was one that kept early hours. Now and then you might see the lights of a cigar store or of an all-night lunch counter, but the majority of the doors belonged to business places that had long since been closed. When about midway of a certain block, the policeman suddenly slowed his walk. In the doorway of a darkened hardware store, a man leaned with an unlit cigar in his mouth. As the policeman walked up to him, the man spoke up quickly. "It's all right, officer," he said reassuringly. "I'm just waiting for a friend. It's an appointment made 20 years ago. Sounds a little funny to you, doesn't it? I'll explain to you if you'd like to make certain it's all straight. About that long ago, there used to be a restaurant where this store stands. It was Big Joe Brady's restaurant. Until 5 years ago," said the policeman. "It was torn down then." The man in the doorway struck a match and lit his cigar. The light showed with a pale light, a square-jawed face with keen eyes, and a little white scar near his right eyebrow. His scarf pin was a large diamond, oddly set. 20 years ago tonight," said the man, "I dined here at Big Joe Brady's with Jimmy Wells, my best chum, the finest chap in the world. He and I were raised here in New York like two brothers together. I was 18, Jimmy was 20. The next morning, I was to start for the West and make my fortune. You couldn't have dragged Jimmy out of New York. He thought it was the only place on earth. Well, we agreed that night that we would meet here again in exactly 20 years from that date and time, no matter what our conditions might be or from what distance we might have to come. We figured that in 20 years, each of us ought to have our destiny worked out and our fortunes made, whatever they were going to be." "Sounds pretty interesting," said the policeman. "Rather a long time between meets, though, it seems to me. Haven't you heard from your friend since you left?" "Well, yeah, for a time we corresponded," said the other. "But after a year or two, we lost track of each other. You see, the West is a pretty big proposition, and I kept hustling around it pretty lively, but I know Jimmy will meet me here if he's alive. He always was the truest, stanchest old chap in the world. He'll never forget. I came 1,000 miles to stand in this door tonight, and it's worth it if my old partner shows up. The waiting man pulled out a handsome watch, the lids of it set with small diamonds. 3 minutes to 10, he announced. It was exactly 10 o'clock when we parted here at the restaurant door. Did pretty well out west, didn't you? Asked the policeman. You bet. I hope Jimmy has done half as well. He was a kind of plotter, though. Good fellow, as he was. I've had time to compete with some of the sharpest wits going to get my pile. A man gets a groove in New York, it takes the West to put a razor edge on him. The policeman twirled his club and took a step or two. I'll be on my way. Hope your friend comes around all right. Gonna call time on him sharp? I should say not, said the other. I'll give him a half hour at least. If Jimmy is alive on Earth, he'll be here by that time. So long, officer. Good night, sir, said the policeman, passing on along his beat, trying doors as he went. There was now a fine, cold drizzle falling, and the wind had risen from its uncertain puffs into a steady blow. The few foot passengers astir in that quarter hurried dismally and silently along with coat collars turned high and pocketed hands. And in the door of the hardware store, the man who had come 1,000 miles to fill an appointment, uncertain almost to absurdity with the friend of his youth, smoked his cigar and waited. About 20 minutes he waited, and then a tall man in a long overcoat with a collar turned up to his ears hurried across from the opposite side of the street. He went directly to the waiting man. "Is that you, Bob?" he asked doubtfully. "Is that you, Jimmy Wells?" cried the man at the door. "Bless my heart!" exclaimed the new arrival, grasping both the other's hands with his own. "It's Bob! Sure as fate, I was certain I'd find you here if you were still in existence. Well, 20 years. It's a long time. The old restaurant's gone, Bob. I wish it lasted so we could have another dinner there. How's the West treated you, old man?" "Bully. It's given me everything I asked it for." "You've changed lots, Jimmy. I never thought you were so tall by 2 or 3 inches. Oh, I grew a bit after I was 20. You doing well in New York, Jimmy?" "Moderately. I have a position in one of the city departments. Come on, Bob. We'll go round to a place I know of and have a good long talk about the old times." Two men started up the street, arm in arm. The man from the West, his egotism enlarged by success, was beginning to outline the history of his career. The other, submerged in his overcoat, listened with interest. At the corner stood a drugstore, brilliant with electric lights. When they came into this glare, each of them turned simultaneously to gaze upon the other's face. The man from the West stopped suddenly and released his arm. "You're not Jimmy Wells," he snapped. 20 years is a long time, but not long enough to change a man's nose from a Roman to a pug. "It sometimes changes a good man into a bad one," said the tall man. "You've been under arrest for 10 minutes, Silky Bob. Chicago thinks you may have dropped over our way and wires us she wants to have a chat with you. You going quietly, are you? That's sensible. Now, before we go on to the station, here's a note I was asked to hand you. You can read it here at the window. It's from Patrolman Wells. The man from the west unfolded the little piece of paper handed him. His hand was steady when he began to read, but it trembled a little by the time he had finished. The note was rather short. Bob, I was at the appointed place on time. When you struck the match to light your cigar, I saw it was the face of the man wanted in Chicago. Somehow I couldn't do it myself, so I went round and got a plainclothesman to do the job. I'm sorry. Jimmy. The Ransom of Red Chief by O. Henry. It looked like a good thing, but wait till I tell you. We were down south in Alabama. Bill Driscoll and myself when this kidnapping idea struck us. There was a town down there, as flat as a pancake, and called Summit. Bill and I had about $600. We needed just $2,000 more for an illegal land deal in Illinois. We chose, for our victim, the only child of an influential citizen named Ebenezer Dorset. He was a boy of 10, with red hair. Bill and I thought that Ebenezer would pay a ransom of $2,000 to get his boy back. But wait till I tell you. About 2 miles from Summit was a little mountain covered with cedar trees. There was an opening on the back of the mountain. We stored our supplies in that cave. One night, we drove a horse and carriage past old Dorset's house. The boy was in the street, throwing rocks at a cat on the opposite fence. "Hey, little boy," says Bill, "would you like to have a bag of candy and a nice ride?" The boy hits Bill directly in the eye with a piece of rock. That boy put up a fight like a wild animal, but at last we got him down in the bottom of the carriage and drove away. We took him to the cave. The boy had 2 large bird feathers stuck in his hair. He points a stick at me and says, "Ha! Paleface! Do you dare enter the camp of Red Chief, the terror of the plains?" "He's all right now," says Bill, rolling up his pants and examining the wounds on his legs. "We're playing Injun. I'm old Hank, the trapper, Red Chief's captive. I'm going to be scalped at daybreak. By Geronimo, that kid can kick hard." "Red Chief," says I to the boy, "would you like to go home?" What for?" says he. "I don't have any fun at home. I hate to go to school. I like to camp out. You won't take me back home again, will you?" "Not right away," says I. "We'll stay here in the cave a while." "All right," says he. "That'll be fine. I never had such fun in all my life." We went to bed about 11 o'clock. Just at daybreak, I was awakened by a series of terrible screams from Bill. Red Chief was sitting on Bill's chest, with one hand holding his hair. In the other, he had a sharp knife. He was attempting to cut off the top of Bill's head based on what he had declared to do the night before. I got the knife away from the boy, but after that event, Bill's spirit was broken. He lay down, but he never closed an eye again in sleep as long as that boy was with us. "You think anybody will pay out money to get a little imp like that back home?" Bill asked. "Sure," I said. "A boy like that is just the kind the parents love. Now, you and the little chief get up and make something to eat while I go around to the top of this mountain and look around." I climbed to the top of the mountain. Over towards Summit, I expected to see the men of the village searching the countryside, but all was peaceful. Perhaps, says I to myself, it has not yet been discovered that the wolves have taken the lamb from the fold. I went back down the mountain. When I got to the cave, I found Bill backed up against the side of it. He was breathing hard with the boy threatening to strike him with a rock. "He put a red-hot tater down my back," exclaimed Bill, "then crushed it with his foot. I hit his ears. You got a gun with you, Sam?" I took the rock away from the boy and ended the argument. "I'll fix you," says the boy to Bill. "No man ever yet struck Red Chief but what he got paid for. You better be careful." After eating, the boy takes a leather object with strings tied around it from his clothes, goes outside the cave, unwinding it. Then we heard a kind of shout. It was Red Chief holding a sling in one hand. He moved it faster and faster around his head. And then I heard a heavy sound and deep breath from Bill. A rock the size of an egg had hit him just behind his left ear. Bill fell in the fire across the frying pan of hot water for washing the dishes. I pulled him out and poured cold water over his head for half an hour. Then I went out and caught that boy and I shook him. "If your behavior doesn't improve," says I'll take you straight home. Now, are you going to be good or not?" "I was only funning," says he. "I didn't mean to hurt old Hank. What did he hit me for? I'll behave if you don't send me home." I thought it best to send a letter to Old Man Dorset that day, demanding the ransom and telling how it should be paid. The letter said, "We have your boy hidden in a place far from Summit. We demand $1,500 for his return. The money to be left at midnight tonight at the same place in the same box as your answer. If you agree to these terms, send the answer in writing by a messenger tonight at 8:30. After crossing Owl Creek on the road to the Poplar Clove, there are 3 large trees. At the bottom of the fence, opposite the 3rd tree, will be a small box. The messenger will place the answer in this box and return immediately to Summit. If you fail to agree to our demand, you will never see your boy again. If you pay the money as demanded, he will be returned to you safe and well within 3 hours." I took the letter and walked over to Poplar Cove. I then sat around the post office and store. An old man there says he hears Summit is all worried because of Ebenezer Dorset's boy having been lost or stolen. That was all I wanted to know. I mailed my letter and left. The postmaster said the mail carrier would come by in an hour to take the mail on to Summit. At 8:30, I was up in the 3rd tree, waiting for the messenger to arrive. Exactly on time, a half-grown boy rides up the road on a bicycle. He finds the box at the foot of the fence. He puts a folded piece of paper into it and leaves, turning back towards Summit. I slid down the tree, got the note, and was back at the cave in a half hour. I opened the note and read it to Bill. This is what it said. "Gentlemen, I received your letter about the ransom you asked for the return of my son. I think you are a little high in your demands. I hereby make you a counter-proposal, which I believe you will accept. You bring Johnny home and pay me $250, and I agree to take him off your hands. You had better come at night because the neighbors believe he is lost, and I could not be responsible for what they would do to anybody they saw bringing him back. Very respectfully, Ebenezer Dorset." great pirates of Penzance, says I, of all the nerve. But I looked at Bill and stopped. He had the most appealing look in his eyes I ever saw on the face of a dumb or talking animal. Sam, says he, what's $250 after all? We got the money. One more night of this boy'll drive me crazy. I think Mr. Dorset's making us a good offer. You aren't going to let the chance go, are you? Tell you the truth, Bill, says I, this little lamb has gotten on my nerves too. We'll take him home, pay the ransom, and make our getaway. We took him home that night. We got him to go by telling him that his father had bought him a gun and we were going to hunt bears the next day. It was 12 o'clock when we knocked on Ebenezer's front door. Bill counted out $250 into Dorset's hand. When the boy learned we were planning to leave him at home, he started to cry loudly and held himself as tight as he could to Bill's leg. His father pulled him away slowly. How long can you hold him? Asked Bill. I'm not as strong as I used to be, says old Dorset. But I think I can promise 10 minutes. Enough, says Bill. 10 minutes, I shall cross the central, southern, and middle western states and be running for the Canadian border. And as dark as it was, and as fat as Bill was, and as good a runner as I am, he was a good mile and a half out of Summit before I could catch up with him. Nothing Gold Can Stay, by Robert Frost. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour, then leaf subsides to leaf. So Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day. Nothing gold can stay. Acquainted with the Night, by Robert Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I've walked out in rain and back in rain. I've outwalked the farthest city light. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I've passed by the watchman on his beat and dropped my eye, unwilling to explain. I've stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street, but not to call me back or say goodbye, and further still, at an unearthly height, one luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Dust of Snow, by Robert Frost. The way a crow shook down on me the dust of snow from a hemlock tree has given my heart a change of mood and saved some part of a day I had rued. Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening, by Robert Frost. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep. And miles to go before I sleep. This poem is called A Great Wagon by Rumi. When I see your face, the stones start spinning. You appear, all studying wanders. I lose my place. Water turns pearly. Fire dies down and doesn't destroy. In your presence, I don't want what I thought I wanted, those 3 little hanging lamps. Inside your face, the ancient manuscripts seem like rusty mirrors. You breathe. New shapes appear, and the music of a desire as widespread as spring begins to move like a great wagon. Drive slowly. Some of us walking alongside are lame. Today, like every other day, we wake up empty and frightened. Don't open the door to the study and begin reading. Take down a musical instrument. Let the beauty we love be what we do. There are hundreds of ways to kneel and kiss the ground. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make sense. The breeze at dawn has secrets to tell you. Don't go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Don't go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the door sill where 2 worlds touch. The door is round and open. Don't go back to sleep. I would love to kiss you. The price of kissing is your life. Now my loving is running toward my life, shouting, "What a bargain! Let's buy it!" Daylight, full of small dancing particles, and the one great turning. Our souls are dancing with you. Without feet, they dance. Can you see them when I whisper in your ear? They try to say what you are, spiritual or sexual. They wonder about Solomon and all his wives. In the body of the world, they say there's a soul, and you are that. But we have ways within each other that will never be said by anyone. Come to the orchard in the spring. There is light and wine and sweethearts in the pomegranate flowers. If you do not come, these do not matter. If you do come, these do not matter. This is A Patch of Old Snow by Robert Frost. There's a patch of old snow in a corner that I should have guessed was a blow-away paper the rain had brought to rest. It is speckled with grime, as if small print overspread it. The news of a day I'd forgotten, if ever I read it. A Time to Talk by Robert Frost. When a friend calls me from the road and slows his horse to a meaning walk, I don't stand still and look around on all the hills I haven't hoed and shout from where I am, "What is it?" No, not as there is a time to talk. I thrust my hoe in the mellow ground, blade end up and 5 feet tall, and plod I go up to the stone wall for a friendly visit. Come In by Robert Frost. As I came to the edge of the woods, thrush music, hark. Now, if it was dusk outside, inside it was dark. Too dark in the woods for a bird by sleight of wing to better its perch for the night, though it still could sing. The last of the light of the sun that had died in the west still lived for one song more in a thrush's breast. Far in the pillared dark thrush music went, almost like a call to come in to the dark and lament. But no, I was out for stars. I would not come in. I meant, not even if asked, and I hadn't been. To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell, who lived from 1621 to 1678. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest. An age, at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state. Nor would I love at a lower rate. But at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And yonder, all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing songs. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turned to dust, and into ashes all my lusts. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in this slow, chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. To view more of my work, check out my YouTube channel at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. Directed by Hunter Ackerman. Endorsed by Wolfgang Beastly. Produced by GWC Productions.
Originally broadcast on GWC Productions YouTube channel, CAPS Media Television Channel 6, KPPQ LP Ventura at 104.1 FM, and on the KPPQ Podcast Network.